some of the things that we bring to the table are some of the unique experiences that we have had over the years, catering to customized solutions that our clients want. And our clients are both institutions and high net worth individuals, and they're all kind of, a lot of them are thinking about the same thing. Just a quick little update in terms of this topic and what I'm seeing in the financial world and the investment world. I'm not sure if it's on the cover, but in the, I don't even think it's come out yet, in the issue of institutional investor, somebody sent me this today, because I'm involved with New York Society of Securities Analysts. We're putting on a sustainable investing conference, which I told you about. So somebody from that, I'm on the committee for that conference, and somebody sent me this today. It's about climate change, and it's called Climate Change and Years of Investing Dangerously. So it's about investment strategies for climate change. So this is a topic that 2 years ago, this would have never been written. So things are definitely changing. We're seeing it in what we do as well, and we're working with endowments. We are working with some small endowments. We're working with foundations, environmental foundations, community foundations, to help them divest or not include oil, gas, coal type companies from their investment portfolios. And in fact, there's an organization that's called divestinvest.org, that if you type that in and go to their website, these endowments and foundations have come out and publicly said that they're doing this. They're taking out the fossil fuel companies from their portfolios. So things are changing. Another example is a socially responsive fund manager that recently divested from all of their fossil fuel companies in their equity portfolio, which they had already done in their balanced portfolio. So vehicles are starting to be created to address these types of things. There's actually a lot more going on in that area. The most common thing that we have heard from an organization you know, 350.org, is the Carbon Tracker 200, and that has been something that we're getting asked a lot about, is removing the Carbon Tracker 200 companies from a portfolio, and it's basically the 100 largest in terms of carbon emissions, coal companies and oil and gas companies. It's not a real functional list. It was created 4 years ago, so it's not something that we can work with, but there are other ways to get about it, and there's other data providers that are out there that are starting to address this. Some of the indexes that we work with actually have industries that you can exclude on a kind of global level to address this, even though it's not exactly the same as that carbon tracker. So the idea is, can you eliminate these companies from your investment portfolio and still earn a competitive rate of return and something that does not add a significant amount of risk or cost to investing in these portfolios? And that's the purpose of this paper, which, again, hot off the presses. We just updated this on Friday. If anybody wants it, give me your email. I can email it to you, or I believe it's also on our website. You can go at aperiogroup.com, go and take a look at it. So that's kind of what we do. Just addressing some of the things that they wanted me to talk about here. One of the reasons why institutions and individuals are doing this in their publicly traded equity portfolios is because a couple of reasons. Number one, the public equity market is a $40 trillion market worldwide, so it's a very, very big market, and if you want to make a statement, it's a pretty good way to do it. Number two, it's relatively easy to do, contrary to some opinions out there, and it doesn't add a significant amount of cost, also contrary to some opinions out there. And the idea behind divesting in terms of their investment portfolio, there's a number of theories. And Imperial Group is not taking an opinion on those theories, whether carbon investment is a good idea or carbon investment is a bad idea in terms of the future performance. But we understand both sides, and our view is that over the long term, it could go either way, or basically be a neutral. But there are those that out there, I quote from this article, an institutional investor, this is a hedge fund manager. If you believe over time a carbon tax is coming, which he does, and if you believe in climate change, 80% of the reserves of energy companies can never be extracted. So basically what that means is that all these oil and gas companies and coal companies will have stranded reserves. It's called the stranded asset theory. And the theory is that if they can't basically bring up all that oil and gas and sell it in the market, which they've already kind of paid for to get at it, then these companies can't produce the type of revenue and they're overvalued. So that's the theory of why some people actually believe that this is a way to make money. Again, our view is we're neutral on it, but we were asked by 350, by As You Sow, by other organizations, by the Responsible Endowment Coalition, to take a look at this issue from an investment standpoint and address some of the, again, the financial implications of divestment. So what we did was, in this study, is we removed oil, gas, and consumable fuel companies, which are basically coal companies, from broad-based market indices. And we, just so you give you a background on us, we're very index focused. We're what's referred to as a passive manager, but we do highly customized portfolios. So some clients may want to remove tobacco stocks from their portfolio. Some clients may want to remove civilian weapons manufacturers, et cetera. In this case, it's oil, gas, and coal companies. And that includes coal, integrated oil, oil, gas, and exploration and production, refining and marketing, and storage and transportation. And that's what we did in this study. And MSCI also did a study about this, and they kind of concur with our findings, although there's a little bit of a difference. And what we found is that it did not add significantly to the risk of the portfolio versus the broad index. And we did this in markets globally, just the US, just Australia, and just Canada. Now Canada was a little different because Canada, the average market share of oil, gas, and coal companies in Canada is about 21%. So it's a very, very big part of their market, so it added a lot more to the risk. But in the US, it was about 7%. Globally, it's about 8%. So that was kind of the findings from the study. And then in terms of performance, as I mentioned, we looked at all kinds of periods. And we went back for global, we went back to 1997. For the US, we went back to 1988. And we looked at kind of 10-year rolling periods for how the performance looked versus the indexes, including these types of companies. And, you know, as you would expect, there will be some times when one will do better than the other and vice versa, but the point is not by a lot. And over the full, like, let's say, 30-year period, as I say, it was very, very minor either way, depending upon when you looked at it. So those were the kind of conclusions from the study. I think about
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
2.5.
2.5. Thank you. So I'll just touch on a couple of other conclusions that we found from this study. Just to give you an idea, what we did in this study and with clients, we're working with, of those 18 clients that I mentioned from Invest, Divest, Philanthropy, we're working with, I think 3 of them are current clients, and 1 of them we're starting to talk to divest of these companies from their portfolios. Again, not believing that it adds significantly to the risk of the portfolios. And some of those clients, what they're doing is actually increasing their allocation in these portfolios to things like alternative energy companies. So this whole idea of divest, invest, we're doing it again in these public markets as well. Making sure that, and there are trustees involved with these foundations that we're working with, obviously, and making sure the investment side is being spoken to as well. So that trade-off is something that we do pay attention to and help that these organizations make that decision as to how much of that alternative energy type company to include in addition to divesting the oil, gas, and coal companies. So it is something that we're seeing, and I'll take questions later.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been asked to sort of connect this to the physical side of the problem, which in my view is on the one side energy, and on the other side climate. The world does need a lot of energy, and it's actually very hard to do without it. We can be here today, for example, because we probably have ways of transportation, but most importantly, we ran out of fertilizer about 100 years ago if it hadn't been for the ability to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and with the help of hydrogen convert it to ammonia and then to fertilizer. But making hydrogen is an energetically intensive process. We couldn't do that without it. If we run out of water, we will have to desalinate, and that will cost you energy. If we simply want to have a population of the scale we have a halfway decent standard of living, the world ends up consuming more energy than today, and I'm not advocating that we waste energy. We probably could do a lot better than we do today, but the rest of the world has a long ways to catch up before they have a decent standard of living, and even if we do better, I think energy is an absolutely critical thing to have. On the other side, there's no question whatsoever that we are doing very severe damage to the climate. The carbon dioxide we emit to the atmosphere is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's building up. It is not coming back out by itself. The time it takes for that CO2 excursion we have created to sort of work its way out of the system is measured in geological time scales. This is hundreds of thousands of years before this is gone completely. And it will take a very long time for the ocean to pick it up. The ocean will acidify in the process, and that has its own set of environmental consequences. But in the meantime, for the next 1,000 years, you can safely say a ton of CO2 you put in the atmosphere will be with us as a climate impact. Half of it actually went into the ocean. But for all practical purposes, as long as we keep emitting CO2, the problem is getting worse. The warming itself is absolutely uncontroversial. There is nothing new about it. The famous physicist and mathematician Fourier knew about this in 1812. He didn't know about carbon dioxide, but he knew that planets have atmospheres and they trap heat, and that's how it works. There is nothing all that new about it, and in the meantime we added detail. There's a lot of discussion, how far can we go before it is too late? I would argue it's probably already too late, and keep in mind we have an enormous amount of momentum. We keep building this up for another decade and another decade, and we are at 450 parts per million. And we can ask, what are the risks, what are the dangers? And I think these second order effects, which we haven't discussed, how much warming do you actually get? What else will do this to the climate? We can have long and lengthy discussions about it. But to me, ultimately that doesn't matter. We can have a long and learned discussion whether we should have stopped at 350 ppm, 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, or whether it's safe to get to 450. And if you're a real optimist, maybe we could go to 550. But all of those, we are nearly locked into getting to already. And it will take us decades to get out of that. And it doesn't really matter where you manage to stop. Once you stopped, you are not allowed to emit any CO2 anymore. If you think 550 is okay, then you have a few more years before you really have to stop. If it's 450, you better step on the brakes as hard as you can possibly do, and you will still overshoot. So we really have a problem, and people have argued, yeah, you cannot prove all the details. Well, yeah, that's right, but there are enormous risks. There are risks to lives, there are risks economic, there are health impacts, all of these things. As we push against these limits, if we get 6 or 7 degree warming, we could kill large numbers of people. If we get 2 or 3 degree warmings, this is already a planet we don't know anymore. This is quite different from the planet we have. So yes, we need to stop. The question is, how do we make this happen while at the same provide energy to a growing world, maybe 10 billion people who want to have a decent standard of living. Right now, more than 80% of the energy we generate in some form or another comes from fossil fuels. We either figure out how to do without that, which overnight in my view is simply not possible, or we figure out how to get rid of that carbon as we produce it and not put it into the atmosphere. I think both of these solutions are possible. I don't want to discuss the investment opportunities in fossil fuels or the investment risks. I think that can cut both ways. I think the companies who are involved in this today will have to figure out how to make the world carbon neutral. What solution they come up with is difficult to predict, in part because there are many different ones. We clearly will have to look at more energy efficiency. We will clearly have to look at non-fossil sources of energy, primarily renewable energy. We have enough solar to run the world on, but it'll take us decades to get there, and it will cost us more than today. The other alternative we probably have no choice about anymore is to come into carbon capture and storage. And the reason I'm saying we don't have a choice anymore is that the IPCC in its latest report sort of talks about what they call negative emissions. They basically say, look, if you want to stay in a safe scenario, and we can paint you a number of them, every single scenario which looks safe, somehow or another managed to have a few decades in the next few decades in which net emissions to the atmosphere are actually negative. We somehow or another pulled carbon dioxide back out and put it somewhere. If we have to come back by 100 ppm, that means we will put an amount of carbon dioxide back somewhere underground, some place where we can hide it safely and permanently, which is about as big, not quite as big, but about as big as all of the emissions we had in the 20th century. So I don't think we really have a choice to not develop these technologies, and that to me actually brings up an enormous conundrum. I'm working right now on capturing CO2 from the air, in part because I'm convinced we're already too late, and we will need that technology in order to come back. We may have to come back 10 ppm, we may have to come back 50 ppm, we may have to come back 100 ppm, which is not all that far-fetched, because if Jim Hansen is right, we should have stopped at 350 ppm. We are right now at 400 ppm. We are going up 2.2, 2.3 ppm a year, and it will take us a couple of decades to stop that, at which point we are at 450 ppm. And if we can't live with that, we have to figure out how to minimize the damage, and it's irreversible in some extent, to come back. So we need these kind of technologies to make things work, and that to me means that the big companies who are involved in fossil fuels ultimately need to be held to solve this problem, because without them, I don't think we can solve it. We need these kind of technologies to make things work, and I think that to me poses the conundrum, how do we actually move forward? But the answer is we do need to deal with the carbon dioxide. We need to stop emitting the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. We probably will need carbon capture and storage technologies, because without it, we cannot balance the books anymore anyhow. And lastly, we need to have other alternatives available as well. But in the end, I'm probably more agnostic than most in the room that I would say if fossil fuels are used without emitting of carbon dioxide into the environment, it is still okay. But we have to solve this problem, and we have to hold everybody responsible, but that means all of us. I rely on the fact that there's an ambulance outside which can bring me somewhere if I have a problem, and it runs, guess what, on fuel. I do fly to see my daughter in Japan, right? And guess how I get there? With jet fuel, right? And so all told, we are all guilty, and we all have to figure out how to create a world which is net carbon neutral. How we get there, I think we have to do everything we can, because the problem is big enough that we don't solve it immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Hello? All right. First of all, before I get into this, I have to mention that I'm getting over a bit of a cold, so can you all hear me okay, like this? Okay, so I don't have to speak loud. That's wonderful. Thank you all for being here so much. I think that this issue is hard to overstate the importance, And your presence here really reflects that, so thank you all for being here. And thank you to the Advisory Committee on Socially Responsible Investment here at Columbia for making this event possible. And my biggest thank you of all to the students of Barnard Columbia Divest, without whom we would not be here even talking about this issue, even drawing the lines between the investment of universities like Columbia in fossil fuels and our responsibility to act. So thank you so much for what you're doing. My name is Ian Trupin, and I'm an organizer at the Responsible Endowments Coalition. The Responsible Endowments Coalition is a network of mostly students who, for the past 10 years, have strived to change the way our universities invest. And our long-term vision is to use investments as a medium by which to change the relationship between universities, well, for the good, to transform the relationship between universities and their communities, and on the broadest level, the world. And so we've done this through a variety of avenues, besides supporting the current fossil fuel divestment campaign. We have also helped students organize their campuses, push administrators to reinvest in their communities, to have very increasingly positive relationships with the economies in which they're situated most directly. We've also worked on shareholder activism on a variety of issues. So we've been developing for a long time our relationship with students and administrators and other partners in working towards ethical investment. And so to start off, I want to give a little bit of a picture of the history of this new fossil fuel divestment movement. And I say new because it really is fairly new. 3 years ago, in spring of 2011, there was a group of Swarthmore students, Swarthmore Mountain Justice, who visited communities in Appalachia that were most directly affected by the ravages of mining there, and particularly mountaintop removal. And they came back with a fire in their bellies, a commitment to do anything they could, everything they could, to dismantle the systems that were impacting so drastically the lives of these people. And the answer that they found of how they could be effective allies in solidarity was working on divestment campaigns. And so we began working with them at that point. Now 3 years later, this has gone viral, and I think we can say that after about 400 colleges and universities in the United States alone are working on divestment campaigns, and we've already seen 10 universities commit to divestment. And I just want to describe really briefly what divestment means, just so we're all on the same page. Divestment, I think, can be boiled down roughly to 3 parts. One is a halt on new investments. Sorry, first of all, as a definition, divestment is the removal of investment in an entity for explicit ethical reasons. And so the first part of this is a halt on new investments in whatever entity. The second part of this is removal of existing investments, and the third part is non-reinvestment in that entity in the future. So that's called screening, negative screening. And the reason really why I wanted to go into the very origins of this movement is because I think it's important to recognize that while there's many sources of inspiration for the student movement right now, a key one has always been working in solidarity with the people who are most directly affected by the harms perpetuated by the fossil fuel industry, be it miners in Appalachia, be it people in the Philippines, be it farmers in Bangladesh. For me, a personal connection is in East Africa, which is where my mother's side of the family comes from. Increasingly, we're hearing from home that rains that used to be predictable like clockwork are erratic, and mostly it's been erring on the side of ruining the harvest. And so that's actually starting to cause hunger. And to the north of us, there's been devastating hunger in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So we have this picture that we take with us, this need to be in solidarity, to stand in solidarity. And we also have climate science, thanks to universities like Columbia, who are supporting scientists who can demonstrate to us the urgency of the issue. We can bring these stories together and move and act. Now, I think that my role here today is also going to be about talking about divestment as compared to other strategies for engagement. And so I want to stress from the beginning that divestment is a strategy. It's not an end in itself. It's not an answer in and of itself. It's what it accomplishes that matters. And in that, it's a complementary thing. And actually, how many people here are familiar with the idea of shareholder engagement, or what that means? I think it might be a good idea to sort of define what that means. So basically the idea is that companies that are publicly traded have shareholders who have a right to express some sort of voice in the way in which the company is managed. And so this can take, the most common form of this is in shareholder resolutions. At annual events, investors can file resolutions on certain behavior that they want the company to take, and then each shareholder, one share, one vote, can vote on the result. And so this has been a way in which some movement has really started on this, and shareholder activism has been extremely powerful up to this point. For about the past 10 years, we have seen organizations, including ICCR, have played a really important role, and they've got us to this point where we now have disclosure. Companies are telling us how much carbon they're actually releasing. They're telling, and in some cases we're even forcing them to say, this is our plan for reducing that carbon that we're taking out of the ground. This is our plan for reducing carbon emissions. And then there are some people who argue that this strategy is sufficient. But I'm here because I believe that it isn't. Because it has taken us to this certain point. But now that we know for a fact that ExxonMobil releases X amount of carbon per year, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to raise the stakes so that we force these companies to confront the reality that they cannot burn that carbon? And the answer is divestment. And I think the importance of divestment can be expressed as in three areas. One is delegitimization, and that's that when you say that you're not willing to profit from an activity, that's the strongest moral statement that an investor can make. It's not that, oh, we want to shift your practices. It's that we completely are unwilling to profit from them, even if it has a consequence, even if it has negative consequences for our own short-term interest. The second is mobilization, and that is that divestment has been a powerful movement to bring people across generations, across the country, together. We've seen this with past divestment movements, including often quoted South Africa, and we're seeing it again today. And it's actually because it's that moral statement that it's so powerful. The third element of this is demystification, and that is because when we talk about climate change, we talk about the language of shared responsibility and commitment to change, but we never really put a face on the obstacle that lies in that path. And the obstacle is pretty clear at this point. It's companies that have are collectively investing $674 trillion annually in exploring for, billion, not trillion, annually in exploring new fossil fuels when we already have too much, when we already have an amount that 80% of which cannot be burned. Those are the people who we need to be targeting more effectively. Sorry, how am I doing time-wise?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So I'll just wrap up by saying that divestment is a strategy, and at Responsible Endowments Coalition and the students we work with, we also talk about a larger picture, and that larger picture includes reinvestment. And thank you, Ken, for beginning to mention this, especially in the context of universities. We're talking about a variety of options that universities can take when they move that money out of fossil fuel companies. They can put it back into other things, including improvements on campus, the returns of which, just in terms of efficiency, can go toe-to-toe with the most successful hedge fund managers. Improvements in efficiency save energy. And through models like the revolving loan fund model, the investments that are, the improvements on campus. And so this is really a sustainable model for investing in the infrastructure that we that we interact with every day. And we've also been advocates of investment in green mutual funds. There are an increasing number of these that are willing to work with large investors. And we also talk about community reinvestment, and for a long time we've been working with students to get universities to put money back in the community. And this is really deals with the issue of resilience, well, with two issues, resilience and justice. Winding up, yeah. Because these communities around our schools, especially the ones that we see affected by events like Hurricane Sandy, are not the leading cause, are not the cause of the disasters that we're seeing around us right now, but they are being most directly affected, and investment in them can help them improve their own resiliency. And it also improves the relationship of colleges with their surrounding communities. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to say good evening too, and also thank you as well. I'm happy to be here. And I did give this some considerable thought. I had a little bit of a mixed message with regard to what I should talk about with regard to ethics, because on the one hand, it seemed that there was a question of climate change ethics, and on the other hand, specifically, fossil fuel divestment ethics. Now, I'm going to focus on the latter, but just in case I'm sort of directed to cover the former as well, I will just very briefly mention it because it's an extremely substantial area in the field of sustainability ethics. So just very briefly on climate change ethics, I can just give you this little sketch, which is that primarily climate change ethics are number one, questions of causality, and in particular, three kinds of causality. The first one is, do humans cause this? The second one is, do some humans cause this more than others? And the third one is, do those who cause it less manage somehow to catch up, nonetheless, with those who cause it more? And what do you do about that? The second set of questions that have to do with climate change ethics are questions of counter-causality. The first set had to do with causality, which is who did it. The second set, counter-causality, is, well, what should be done about it? And that also has three major subdivisions. That is, number one, should we all be changing our lifestyles, choices, preferences, etc.? Number two, should those of us who are specifically engaged in more sort of blameworthy ways of life, especially revamp what we do, and also recompense those who are suffering effects from this? And also, should we steward the others in some way, even if that means acting in a paternalistic way? All of that is debated. And number three is, should even those who are less at fault engage in some prophylactic behavioral changes, because there seems to be an inexorable tendency to veer in the direction of consumer lifestyles and so on. So we have those two major sets of questions, and you can see just from how I've run through them and probably what you know about the arguments surrounding climate change, who should pay, who should recompense, how much, beneficiary pays, polluter pays, beneficiary who can afford to pay pays, and not beneficiary who can't afford to pay, etc. You know that that's a very convoluted area of ethics. And second, I would say, apart from those questions, the whole question, all of the questions are beclouded by two other issues, which are in a way stratagems, avoidance stratagems. One of them is kind of constantly to reopen the debate on whether humans have caused it. And then there's an antecedent stratagem, which is to open the debate constantly on whether it's happening at all. So even though the questions are complex, there are also stratagems at play on how to avoid discussing the questions. But all of this is kind of percolating out there at the same time. Now, that's all I'm going to say specifically about climate change ethics. So I can turn to fossil fuel divestment ethics, which is a much narrower, but nonetheless a very complex kind of ethical question. Very, very interesting. And when I thought about this, and I thought, what should I say, you know, and how can I discuss this, and what are all the ramifications, because this area is not even as well developed as climate change ethics, very, very emergent. I did constantly think over and over in my concern to sort of say something that was relevant about something that had bothered me very, very much when I was just in elementary school. And what it was that in my science classes, we always had narratives and information on the tar pits and all of the animals who crashed into the tar pits and couldn't get out of them again. And as we know from scientific evidence, many, many bones of animals have been extracted from the tar pits. Millions of bones. Even the mammoths couldn't get out of them. Now, supposedly we're smarter than them. As you know, the tar pits they're about 5 or 6 still on the planet. 3, unfortunately, are in California. I don't know exactly how that happened, but in any case, things that fall in have a hard time getting out. And they are a form of bitumen that is very, very viscous, thick petroleum that geologically, naturally seems to come to the surface. So it is directly related to, you know, oil deposits and things like that. But in any case, the question obviously is, in some metaphorical sense, are we sort of mired in a kind of a global tar pit, our own species? And is fossil fuel divestment a way to help us get out? Are we going to be able to get out of this tar pit that we are stuck in? All right, now moving on then, like, well, what about the fossil fuel divestment effort? Will it help us get out of this situation in which we are mired? I would say that unlike Ken and Ian, when we're doing ethics, unlike, you know, the financial analysis with global indicators, etc., we tend to want to know how things are in that particular case, rather than according to global indices. So what we would want to know is, how is this in particular, even if it's negligible, how is it going to affect Colombia? Now, I cannot really answer that question because I am not privy to the structure of the portfolio. And I have been told, nonetheless, that maybe $1 billion is in question, the rest of the endowment being in closed funds or something like that, that you cannot change. Of that billion, I am unsure. I don't know if any of you knows how many dollars are involved with things like Mobil, ExxonMobil, Chevron, etc. I don't know. However, one thing that I heard that was not mentioned, or that I did not hear mentioned, is obviously if you divest, sell stock, you do have to, don't you have to pay taxes on the capital gains?
An individual does, but
So we would not. So that money would be free because we're a non-profit. So it's a possibility then that maybe the effects would in fact be somewhat negligible. And then we would only have the question left is, could we develop something like a divestment impact statement? What would we invest in instead? Now, I know we've heard a lot about renewables. However, I have read that to create a wind turbine, you need tons of steel and concrete. And that is produced through the use of fossil fuels. So I'm not sure that the renewables themselves are fully divested of the fossil fuels. Another thing that we could invest in, would you say or not say? Automotive, shipping, airplane, industries. Maybe off the list because they use fossil fuel. So those are out. Then suppose you wanted to ask about agricultural, clothing, or other such industries. What do they use to transport their products? Vehicles, diesel fuel. So all I'm asking here is this, how clean would the portfolio be? Or would you still end up with a lot of dirty fuel in there? And that's an ethical question, not just a question about chemistry or whatever. Because when we talk about, ethics, we talk about having clean hands or dirty hands. Now, I was sort of charged here to discuss the question of what the objective is. The objective is obviously to help shut down the fossil fuel industries. But I'm not sure if we sold it, would someone else buy that stock? Ken? Would someone else buy it? For the other institutions that have sold their stock, did that stock just go down the drain, or did other investors buy it? I don't know, but it's something from an ethics perspective to think about, particularly if those who purchase it are unscrupulous in comparison to Colombia. That is, that they would not engage in shareholder responsibility, questioning, letter writing, and so on. So who would buy that? I don't know. But I'm just trying to say there are obviously a lot of questions to raise. So when you ask the question about, like, should there be a divestment impact statement, you were also asking, what will happen in terms of that stock? What will be the ripple effects and so on? Who will get their hands on it then? Still, that doesn't obviously shut down the question. But what it does ask, if I might borrow a few terms from ecology, how many of you have studied ecology, maybe? I don't know, but you surely know the terms shallow and deep ecology. I would borrow those terms and say, there is such a thing as shallow ethics and deep ethics. And shallow ethics is where you do something, and it can be the right thing to do, but nonetheless, it has a cascade of effects that are not necessarily going to enhance you in a moral sense. Now, it may be, for example, that in the French Revolution, the ethical thing to do was to get rid of the king and the aristocracy. But obviously, it was done in a way that had a lot of problems in terms of the consequences, the methods, etc. And so all I'm saying is that when you ask for a change, you have to ask the question, who is going to accept the moral responsibility for any negative spillover effects. And whatever you do that is in any way sort of revolutionary, we know from looking at history that there are a lot of negative spillover effects, and a lot of people can be hurt, whether it's simply losing your job or being guillotined accidentally or whatever. Who is going to stand up and say and accept, yes, that's my fault, too? So I'm just saying the ethical side is quite complicated. And as I say, one of the big questions is, what should the portfolio look like? So we will exclude all companies that use and rely upon trucking, airplanes, and shipping. The difficulty obviously is that when I say that it's like we're in a global tar pit, is that it's not just the fossil fuels, it's really the whole industrial era, in the sense that every ball bearing, every piece of steel, whatever, needs apparently grease and oil, except, I'm sure Klaus knows this much infinitely better than I do, substitutes are being developed. So we have different ways of making things go on and on. Okay, thank you. Finish up.
Okay.
So anyway, what I would like to say is that we want to make sure that the effort is not just a token change. And we've heard that term before in our history. We have to be very attentive to when we want to make changes and they turn out just to be tokens, and that they have consequences that are problematic. And I would just add to this something that has not been mentioned, which is that I've been talking about these other industries that are heavily in themselves invested in fossil fuels. But we ourselves are, and something that has not been mentioned here is that a lot of what comes out of 1 barrel of crude is everything that is plastic. So when you ask for divestment, will you go back to your room and throw away your toothbrush and your iPhone and your nylon backpack and your sneakers and every single thing? Well, maybe not. But still, on the other hand, you know, you might say it's okay because this has important symbolic value, which undoubtedly it does, and it may actually set an example and so forth. But nonetheless, we need to weigh it against the fact that many industries are, as I say, invested, which should affect how you then structure the portfolio. And also, what will you do about personal investment in these kinds of products? Okay, so I'll close here, and that's just to think about.
All right. Thank you for that great question. And yeah, I think in the student movement, we think about this a lot. What is the role of different actors? And it's very apparent to us that the role of university actors is divestment. And this is because, not because that divestment in and of itself is going to erase the problem or is going to cripple Exxon, because nobody believes that, not for 1 minute. And I mean, I think actually this reflects on the question that Adela was raising, you know, is somebody else going to buy that stock that you sell? And yeah, absolutely, somebody is. And I mean, I think that critics of divestment strategy have often actually gone back to a study produced in 1999 of the South African divestment, which argued that actually even during the peak year of university divestment, 1986, there was no visible, sorry, this is loud, if there's no visible decline in the value of the company slated for divestment, and there was no visible impact on the South African Stock Exchange. And then they go on to make the conclusion that, oh, the divestment movement had no role. But at the same time, we can look at the statements of the leaders of the time, including F.W. de Klerk, the last president of the apartheid system, and he said, when the divestment movement started, that's when I knew that apartheid had to end. He said that. Those are his words. And the same thing from leaders from the other side. And so clearly what we have here, and what's actually very apparent if you look at the language and rhetoric that's being used by the student movement, is that the immediate impact of what students are doing is not actually economic, but moral, and it's movement building. It's because divestment is that powerful moral statement that it creates action, and then it moves to the next set of stakeholders who have the more direct role to play, and that is government. Without action, without grassroots action like this, we can never expect government to take the leadership. At least nothing that we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years can lead us to that conclusion. And I think that it's very valid to connect this, again, to the Free South Africa movement, because in 1986, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. And first of all, it was passed in the House, which was controlled by Democrats. Second of all, it was passed in the Senate, that was controlled by Republicans. And then last of all, it was vetoed by President Reagan, popular president, at the peak of his popularity. But his veto was overthrown by a 2/3 majority that was led by Republican leaders, which shows that this was no longer a political issue, it was a moral issue, and that nobody was willing to stand up for apartheid at that point. And how did we get there? We got there through a movement, right?
Okay, Ian, thank you. Ken?
Yes, thank you. Good, again, a very good question. And I think from our standpoint, we are very reactionary to our clients' needs. And we see many reasons for...
Reactionary or responsive?
Responsive.
Okay.
Yes, we're very, well, that's actually what we call our SRI is socially responsive investing as opposed to socially responsible, because everybody has a different definition of what's responsible. And we see many reasons for divestment of all kinds of industries in terms of stocks in the portfolios. Things like, well, we don't want to profit from something that's in our portfolio that goes against our values. We want to align our investment portfolio with our value set. We want to take issue with a certain aspect of it and not own those companies. And that's really what we're being responsive to. Another example of this with the unfortunate shootings in Connecticut was civilian weapons manufacturers. We saw a huge spike in demand from our clients. Remember, most of our clients are individuals, families, and some institutions that said, we don't want these companies in our portfolio, we want you to not buy them or sell them. And again, these go against our values. We do not want to profit from these companies. So that's really where we're coming from, is providing an investment solution that does not include these companies, that still offers something that is very competitive with markets.
Okay, thank you. Klaus?
Yes, I do agree with you that we're all shaped by our own backgrounds, and I would argue there clearly is an imperative, a moral imperative, if you wish, that we have to stop climate change, because we are creating for future generations a disaster. So we have to figure out how to stop that. And clearly, we are all in a way implicated, because the oil companies are not burning the oil, we are. And so we have to figure out how to make this happen. And it may mean that we stop using fossil fuels completely. At the very least, we have to figure out how to stop CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. For that, we need to get a broad consensus among all people. I see the divestment strategy as one which sets a signal, and in that sense, the comparison to South Africa is perfectly right. You are making a loud statement which may be listened to. My concern, and this is probably where I'm coming from, is I'm not sure that is the practical signal. As long as I still drive a car and fly an airplane, I feel a little hypocritical blaming the oil company for it. But I think also we all need to get together, and I think this serves more in a polarization rather than in figuring out how to pull together to make this happen. Right? Oil companies will have to pay a price for CO2. Oil companies will have to get rid of that CO2 again.
And they may want to abandon oil in favor of renewable energies. This discussion was here 40 years ago, and it could very well come back. But to engage them in that, I think it's not to say you are the culprit and we take the drug.
Okay, thank you. Adela?
Yes, well, I would just like to add, I guess, that to me it seems, as I mentioned, if you're looking at the particular case, and there's no, as you suggest, Ken, no reason to think that there would be any significant losses or anything. I couldn't see, you know, why one would necessarily want to keep it. I mean, if keeping the stock, if getting rid of it is, you know, not going to cause any serious cutbacks on programs for students because there's a loss of, say, you're saying no dividends loss, no any kind of loss, well, then why not? You know, the only thing that concerns me, obviously, is that one not just become sort of complacent at that point and think, well, you know, we've divested ourselves of this stock, that is, Columbia as a whole has, and we can just forget about all the ways that we nonetheless ourselves remain invested in it in such a way that is just going to fuel its value for other people to purchase it. Because we keep using the fossil fuels and the products and petrochemicals ourselves. So, you know, it's almost like on the one hand, well, why not get rid of it if there are no harms? But on the other hand, are we not also fueling investment by our way of life at the same time that we're asking for divestment? And so that to me is you know, kind of a serious issue. Obviously, it's nice to stand for something and so on, but are you standing for it in a holistic way or just with regard to one particular sort of measure?
Thank you very much. So it's time to hear your questions, your comments, your concerns. And if you have a specific question for a panelist, that's great, or the two organizing committees, right? Either the, you know, Barnard, Columbia Divest, or the advisory board, anyone here that would be willing to answer questions or make comments as well. So I'm going to put the mic there. Come on up and stand, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
My name is Courtney Carroll. I'm a graduate student at the School of Public Health. I just had a general question. I think this would go to the divestment group. I was just wondering about what's the actual status of this conversation at Columbia? Is this seriously on the agenda? That's pretty much my question.
Should we just take a few questions so more people can ask them? And then...
Yeah, is there another question right away so we can take a couple and then get the responses? Yes. You want to use the mic. This is a wonderful building, but it's really high. That's it. There you go.
My name is Flora Moyer. I work for the Earth Institute. My question is why divestment versus shareholder activism?
Great. Okay, so the first question is it to the advisor? No, it's to the Barnard Columbia Divest.
Yeah, so hi, I'm a member of Barnard Columbia Divest for Climate Justice. My name is Daniela, and as for the status of our campaign, so we started in November 2012, and we think it's definitely on the agenda. In the fall, we actually went through with Columbia College on the first ever process of setting up a direct ballot initiative vote where students could vote on an issue and not just a candidate, and 73.7% of Columbia College students voted in favor of divestment. We've started a very strong and open relationship with the Advisory Committee for Socially Responsible Investing this year, making our initial presentation to them in the fall and collaborating since then to bring this panel into existence. And we have found that the sustained conversation, whether in op-eds for or against fossil fuel divestment in Spectator, has been a really promising sign for the fact that this is a question that students are considering. And actually, students from our group just got back literally today from a convergence in San Francisco of hundreds of schools working on this issue. We're in touch with the New York City Student Network. And we've also been collaborating on the questions of endowment transparency and our responsibilities in social justice movements with campaigns like Columbia Prison Divest, which is examining a different aspect. So I think we are definitely here seriously on the agenda and around to stay for a while, hopefully.
Okay, thank you. Why divest over shareholder activism? Both of you want to make a comment? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So do you want to use the mic here?
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for this question, first of all, and I think I can outline it a little bit more clearly. First of all, this really shouldn't really be considered a versus question because these strategies are complementary, and what I try and highlight is that shareholder advocacy has taken us to a certain point, and it's accomplished things like achieving disclosure on the amount of carbon that companies put out, which has been interesting, first of all, and it's been useful to know from the point of divestment movements being able to say these are the worst offenders. So it was a way to get to a certain point. And actually, so another example of a kind of thing that shareholder advocacy has been able to do is recently an organization that REC works closely with, As You Sow, co-filed with I believe Arjuna Capital Management, a resolution for Exxon to report on its sustainability plans until 2040. And that report actually just came out this past week, and what Exxon said was that in 2040 we foresee a world in which 5% of our energy comes from renewables. 75% of it comes from fossil fuels. And so I think at some point when somebody sees that, there should be a disconnect going on, because we see this data from climate scientists telling us that if that happens, it's not a world that any of us wants to live in. And then there's fossil fuel companies who seem to be totally complacent, and that's business as usual, and that's what they're aiming for with their business strategy. And so that's the point to which shareholder advocacy has gotten us to, knowing and actually getting Exxon to be very honest about what they actually foresee in the future. And the CEO of Exxon has spoken openly about how he thinks that the way to respond to climate change is to adapt. We'll just switch our agriculture up to Siberia, and then we'll all be fine. And that's what they really believe. And so there's a certain point where this kind of dialogue helps, and there's a certain point where you need to have some other form of action.
Okay, thank you. You want to make a comment?
Real quick.
Yeah.
Sure. So real quick, I'll just echo what Ian said. One of the reasons we started to actually get involved in this whole area was from As You Sow. And it wasn't on the divestment side, it was actually on the shareholder activism side. Why did we get involved with them? But they actually came to us, and the reason why they came to us was because in order to be a shareholder activist, you have to own the shares. And so our clients own the shares. If you don't own the shares, you can't be in the game to have a voice. So it's really, it is a question of this whole continuum of both shareholder activism and divestment as opposed to one or the other.
Great. Yes.
Yeah, I do believe in some ways we have to be activists on this, and not just as shareholders, but the first and foremost companies who are out there to make a profit will have a very hard time adding costs to their products unless you force them. And I think we have to regulate this. There has to be a price on carbon, otherwise it doesn't happen. And we have to do this outside of shareholders being active, but at the same time we have to be inside and say, you've got to live with that because we want to live with that. And so I would be much more in favor of that route, because ultimately, let me stress this again, we can't do without energy, and going from 85% to 75% is already a big, big change, but it is clearly not enough. So we have to push on this much, much harder than we have in the past, but it's our will to outlaw CO2 emissions to the atmosphere and figure out how to solve the problem. And I think the companies will follow if you force them to do that.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question.
And your name?
I'm Huirong. I'm sophomore from Columbia College. And the question actually is mentioned by one of the panel. If one company divests, who will invest instead? Because climate change is a global thing. And America is exporting more and more coal and fossil fuel to the other part of the world. So do you have a global network? Because I don't want to demonize fossil fuel too much because it shapes American democracy. We embrace fossil fuel. And right now, the developing countries like China, India, they are just start to enjoy such kind of democracy brought by fossil fuel. So I think it's a really complicated question, considering it's historical, political, ethical, all the things combined together. So I just want to ask the opinions of the panelists. What do you think, in which way we could address this problem?
Great, thank you. Let's take another question.
Hi, my name is Keith. I'm a first year general studies student. I hear a lot of the conversation about carbon, but I've also read, perhaps incorrectly, that there are other greenhouse gases which are also very dangerous, such as methane. Perhaps Professor Lackner could speak to that in more detail. So in speaking of divestment, I'm wondering if there's other divestment strategies that include things like the beef industry, which I know is one of the largest producers of methane gas, which, according to my understanding, methane is 3 times heat trapping as carbon. So, yeah, what about other greenhouse gases?
Okay, let's take those first 2. Who wants to begin in terms of the kind of the global context, the first question? Yes.
I would just say to your question.
Are you able to, you want to use the mic?
I don't know if there's I can understand what you're saying in terms of, the situation of China and so on. But there might be some accommodation possible, and that is, I don't know if you have, studied this, but quite a few of the divestments that I've read about have been over a period of time. They didn't just occur instantaneously. There was some sort of phase-in time, and so I guess we would call that something like a progressive divestment, and it sometimes is used as a tool like to mirror the progress of society. So let's just say you have 100 bits of stock in companies that are fossil fuel based, and society is now 5% renewable, then initially you would divest 5% and keep investing in the renewables, and so on, and then as that grew more to 10%, you would divest more, but overall there would be a whole time framework. So I'm not exactly sure how that could be accommodated, but there is the possibility that there be a time framework attached to a divestment, so that more people would feel comfortable getting on board with it.
Okay, methane.
Before I talk about the methane, let me briefly answer your question as well. I think it's absolutely right. Energy is an incredibly important foundation, but at the same time, we have to change because we are running into a brick wall otherwise. But I'm not sure how to best do it, but we have to do lots of things in parallel. It's true that carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. Methane actually is 100 times stronger as a greenhouse gas than CO2. But on the other hand, if you emit methane today, in about a decade from now, it's CO2 in the atmosphere. So therefore, the conventional factor is about 2025, which allows for the fact that it lives more shortly. But I think there's a misconception about CO2 because in that discussion, it's effectively said to 100, 120 years. And that impact actually lasts much longer than that. If CO2 would go away in 100 years, the problem would be relatively easy. I think the proper way to think about it is for the next 1,000 years, we are stuck with what we put out unless we pull it back. And for the next 100,000 years, you can see the effect. So from that point of view, I'm actually of the opinion that CO2 is more important than nearly all the other greenhouse gases because it has this persistence. But yes, methane production in natural gas pipelines, leaking in drilling for gas, that needs to be looked at as well. But I think the far bigger problem is the CO2.
Thank you. Yes, next questioner. Oh, did you want to make a quick comment?
Yeah, I especially wanted to comment on the developing world question.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Real briefly, we got 4 wonderful people
sorry,
here who want to get into the
sorry.
discussion.
It's fine.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it fast.
Real quick.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to deal with this question, and I think it relates to a lot of things that we've been talking about recently. And the way this conversation can often be directed is a conversation really about materialism and this idea of development. And I mean, it even echoes when we're talking about, okay, so does divestment mean for consistency's sake that I also have to stop driving a car, I have to go off the grid and change every aspect of my personal behavior? And I think that it's important to recognize that some people actually can do that, and it's great for them when they can. But for most of us, we actually don't have a choice, and that doesn't mean that we're evil. I mean, we also don't have a choice about the fact that we produce carbon dioxide when we breathe. But that doesn't mean that we're not equipped to act to prevent global warming. And with the question of the developing world, I think just a fact that is really important to understand is that the coming climate change is going to affect the developing countries especially strongly. And so that, yeah, there's this issue of equity that we have to take into account historical questions about, you know, who has been able to take advantage of the luxury of this increasingly cheap source of energy for a long time, and who hasn't been able to do that. And so this needs to be factored into our governmental stakeholders' actions. And so actually, ultimately, one last thing I wanted to say is that the world governments as a whole subsidize the fossil fuel industry by $775 billion. And there's actually been studies to show that if countries actually were able to reduce this blind faith in fossil fuel companies and end those subsidies, they'd actually benefit from it. So there's this belief that we have persisting, that we absolutely need to have fossil fuels right now, and we need to make everything easy for them. And that's actually not borne out by fact.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello. My name is Josh Brown. I'm actually one of Professor Lackner's PhD students, but I don't have any plan. He didn't give me any questions to ask.
Okay.
Just have my little note.
But he's listening to your question anyway, grading you.
So some of these are probably going to sound like stupid questions just because I don't have a lot of background in this discussion, but maybe it's a question for the Divestment Committee or maybe for Ken. If we don't know what percent of Colombia's portfolio is actually fossil fuels, I doubt it's 1/8, like you mentioned. That would seem like irresponsible.
No, I just meant that 1 billion is subject to being changed. The other billions are in, what do you call them?
So you were saying 1 billion of the 8 billion in the portfolio.
Yes, but all that billion are not fossil fuels.
Right. But there must be some other universities that are more transparent than Columbia. I'm just curious, as a parallel, I did some Googling while you guys were talking. I found anything from like 0.1% to 5%. I didn't see anything more than that. But I'm just curious what your experience is, either with the committee or Ken, or maybe you know. What are we talking about? It's clearly, none of this is going to move the needle from an investment perspective either way, but I'm curious if it's actually worth the effort from a social responsibility perspective. And then to follow up to that, it's actually something that Professor Lackner mentioned, but I wrote this down before he mentioned it. I go to quite a lot of energy conferences. It's what my PhD work is in, and without a doubt, what you hear from the large energy companies, even the ExxonMobils, the BPs, they always say, we need an energy policy. Without an energy policy, they don't really have a direction where they need to improve efficiency other than if it helps their bottom dollar or reduce their carbon emissions. It seems like, just this is my opinion, that my effort and time, if I wanted to be an activist, would be spent on getting an energy policy, not divestment.
All right, thank you. We'll come back to those 2 questions. Yes.
And that's perfect because my question, I think, dovetails really nicely with the last
And your
one.
name?
I'm Karina, yes. I'm Karina. I'm a member of Barnard Columbia Divest, a student in Columbia College. So I guess this question pulls from a few of the themes that we've been talking about. But, I mean, you know, personally, if I could live the kind of lifestyle where I didn't drive a car and could reduce my carbon footprint as much as possible, I would do that, and I try my best to live, you know, a green, ecologically friendly lifestyle. But I've observed, I think, other members of Barnard Columbia Divest have made this observation as well, which is why we chose to work on this campaign, that the fossil fuel industry is actually actively preventing the possibility of individuals like us to be able to live clean, carbon neutral lifestyles in a variety of ways. And if you consider the firm grip that the fossil fuel industry has on our political system in terms of campaign contributions, look at the recent Supreme Court ruling that just came out. In terms of lobbying, the fossil fuel lobby is the third largest in the country after healthcare and pharmaceuticals, billions of dollars. Going towards getting our politicians not to produce an energy policy or to produce an energy policy that is permissive in allowing them to continue recklessly burning fossil fuels. Thirdly, also, just in terms of competition in the market, preventing the development of clean energy sources and alternatives that would not involve such intensive extraction and use of fossil fuels. So in light of all of those factors and the political implications, from a purely political perspective of, I certainly agree with you, Dr. Lackner, that we're going to need governments to step in and regulate and create, put a price on carbon. But I personally am not sure how that's going to happen without breaking the stranglehold that the fossil fuel industry has on the, on our world leaders. So I'm wondering what tactics you think would be useful in terms of moving forward politically, and if divestment could fit into that or not, whether or not it would be effective.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's start. So let's start with the first. It's a question of transparency of the portfolios. Would you want to make a comment?
My name is Ursula Bellini. I'm the Associate Director for Socially Responsible Investing at Columbia. So I'm an administrator, and I work with the advisory committee. Just to clarify something, the advisory committee provides ethical and moral advice to the trustees on the directly held investments of the university. That represents about $1 billion. And as you know, the total endowment is about $8.2 billion. So it's not so much that, we have $1 billion, it's not at all that we have $1 billion invested in fossil fuel. It's that we're talking about providing a recommendation to divest or not to divest that portion of the portfolio. So if that makes sense. Somebody asked about the actual percentage. We checked last night or 2 nights ago. We had one stock in the top 200 we had one stock in the fossil-free 350. So it represents an actually relatively small portion.
Energy policy, the sort of analysis really is the impact on lobbying of the industry, and what are some of the tactics that might be effective, right, in sort of breaking that open. Anybody want to respond? I'll respond. I'm no longer the moderator because I work at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. This past year we had about 47 resolutions that went to on issues related to climate change, and a number were around lobbying. Those were not only fossil fuel companies, but other companies to get disclosure on the amount of lobbying directly, but also through industry associations. So you think of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the role that they play, so we're also working to really try to raise the transparency on the corporate, giving through like a U.S. Chamber of Commerce on these particular issues. But I think it's fair to say that it'll take a lot more than that. And when you have incidents where energy policy is put together by the U.S. government, and Mr. Cheney was was really instrumental in getting a task force together to do that. It was, I think it's fair to say, and accurate to say, really skewed because of the lack of transparency and because it was just really representing one stakeholder, where we need, obviously, a real energy policy needs the stakeholders that are very visible but also invisible, the ones that have the major impact. And I think of Bangladesh and all the flooding that's been taking place there. So, at any rate, I think it's a really critical issue, and I'm not sure we have great tactics, but I think we need to look at what would a good energy policy look like, and a university.
It also is a broader issue. I mean, you have part of the problem. Money talks, and you have a sector of the economy which is 4 or 5% of the total. So don't be too surprised that they have a loud voice in Washington. By the same token, Apple has a pretty loud voice too, and for that matter, the banks do, right? Yeah. So this is a general problem with our political system that you can get the best politician money can buy, right? So that problem, I think, is independently there. But I think in the end, we all are at some level to blame. I recall it's not all that long ago when people said we need a gasoline tax, and there was a riot over that, right? We were very, very adamantly opposed to that. And I have a very hard time seeing how we can get to that carbon tax or that carbon fee or that control, but people are trying. I mean, EPA is going out and saying, look, if you want to build a coal plant, it better not emit any more than a natural gas-fired power plant. So the political system is always messy, and I don't think energy is particularly special on that.
Okay.
Can I?
Yeah.
Just the
Ken?
last.
Sure.
The one before.
Were people able to hear Klaus in the back without the mic? Yeah? Okay, good. No? All right, use the mic.
So I just want to make a quick statement about the ease of the percent of oil gas companies in endowment portfolios, et cetera, and what we're seeing now. You mentioned that the direct investment is about $1 billion of the $8 billion, but the other $7 billion, to the extent, I have no idea what it's invested in, but what we're finding with others, and not necessarily even of the same size, is that they're invested in commingled vehicles. So these are vehicles that are managed by investment companies that are funds, basically, that colleges and others invest in on a commingled basis. So they buy shares in a fund, and it's kind of an existing structure. And so what we've heard is, well, I'm locked into this commingled fund and I can't change it. Okay, so that's kind of, and if you look at an index, which most of these are index funds, they're anywhere between 7 and 8% in terms of the oil and gas companies. So to the extent that one of these commingled fund providers provides a vehicle, X these companies, that's the way it can be done in that way, in that form.
Okay. Yes, next question.
Hello, my name is Michael, and I'm a sophomore here at Columbia. And my question is to the Committee on Socially Responsible Investment. And basically my concern is that I was wondering how we can be sure that the student voice is getting heard and represented and acted upon to the extent that is appropriate. So as I guess most people here know by now, about 3/4 of Columbia students voted yes on fossil fuel divestment. And yet at the same time, and this is not speaking about Columbia itself, but more sort of referring to what I perceive to be the national conversation, there seems to be this sort of silly back and forth that a lot of activists are facing with, first being told, oh, we have a duty to increase the amount of returns, then that argument fades away, and then it's, oh, divestment wouldn't be so effective, and then that fades away, and then oh, divestment is only for extreme circumstances, but then it turns out climate change is extreme. So I'm wondering how we at Columbia we students can have that sort of accountability and be sure that both our voices are being heard to the extent that's appropriate, and that, you know, the process is as fast as possible and as transparent as possible, and that the passion that genuinely exists amongst, you know, hundreds and hundreds of students here gets fully represented.
Okay, thank you.
So first of all, just a couple of, I think, technical responses, and then a more personal and maybe comprehensive one. So the technical responses are that we have representatives, as you know, on AXRI's board of students, alumni, faculty, researchers, and also 2 non-voting members. So the students also are chosen from schools that rotate every year. So we make sure that we have students from the business school, from SIPA, from social work, from Teachers College. That was done on purpose to make sure we have a representative sample on AXRI's board of voices. They're a very diverse group of voices on AXRI's board. We do not all believe the same things. We come from different disciplines, we have different political views, religious views, ethics views, you name it. That's what democracy is about, that's what dialogue is about, and coming up with consensus is a hard thing, but we struggle really hard and we succeed sometimes, and sometimes we don't. And when we don't succeed, we decide how to go forward. And a lot of that is decisions about what we can do next as a committee, knowing that we don't have much power, but we do have the voice of Columbia's students, faculty, researchers, and alumni. So that said, I think the technical aspects of representation is on the board and it's in our DNA. And the other aspect is that there are sort of formal channels to engage with institutions and committees. And the formal channels are really important to respect because that's how partnerships get developed and that's how trust gets developed. So the formal channels of partnering with us is getting in touch with Ursula and setting up a meeting, and we're all really easy to meet with because we all want to engage with students. At least I am, and I know the new board members are very much so. I work on carbon finance. I'm a sustainable social enterprise instructor. You're preaching to the choir on a lot of these issues. So you should know that you have a lot of people who ideologically and I think intellectually understand these issues and are committed to them. And I think it's really just about the craft and the art of communication, which really has to start with being able to discuss really tough issues and discuss them in an informed debate, which is what today is. So just to respond to you on the comprehensive side, which is we're incredibly open to continuing this deep level of discussion. These are complex, wicked problems which need complex, wicked solutions. But they also need really simple information and data. And having all of these incredible panelists up here to help us understand how to go forward with that conversation is for me incredibly valuable as someone who's going to represent Columbia's voices on AXRI's board. But we also can't do it without you guys. So all of the research that you do, all of the ideas that you have, the more that you can put those into documents that are well cited, because we're an academic community, we want good research. The more you can give us that good research rooted in interesting, thoughtful dialogue and debate and citations, and give us information that we can debate in the committee, you can expect good results, which are more discussions, which are concerted actions, and I think most importantly, ability to have these types of discussions discussed in even higher levels than AXRI, because AXRI is a pretty low-level institution in the pecking order of Columbia. So just wanted to respond to you on that and to all of you, I hope that's adequate. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Because it seems to vacillate between sort of an adamant pursuit of divestment to a sense that divestment is not a significant thing because there are bigger problems that are related to even foreign policy or something like that. There seems to be, a sense like that this is critical and a sense that it's just a piece of a larger critical mass. And I can understand that. All I can say is from the perspective of ethics and the whole new field of sustainability management and so on, I think the general sense is that we do have a lot of conflict of interest in the regime. And on both sides of the aisle, and that there are a lot of serious issues, and that we probably need a new kind of public manager. But being a public manager means being committed to the public interest rather than to one or another particular party or something like that. And so we have found that in other case studies where we had tremendous corruption in some other regimes besides this one, and it was.
So one question that I wanted to respond to also is the one talking about recognizing, well actually I think two questions really talking about recognizing the immediacy of the issue. The fact that this is not something like the NASA report recently came out, which talked about the collapse of industrial civilization in the next 14 years. Well, very real thing, but also what about what's happening right now as we speak? What happened 3 years ago? What happened in Syria between 2006 and 2011 when they had the most severe drought in memory, which was the spark that lit the flame of the revolution that's happening there right now. And this kind of conflict we can expect to continue happening. And world leaders saying, and the IPCC saying that the most immediate effects of climate change that we can expect to see right now are conflicts and like mass starvation, things that we've already seen in the past few years. So yeah, absolutely, we need to have that urgency and that immediacy. We need to stop talking about even just 2040 when this is all guesswork and we can see what's happening right now. And also the other thing sort of about this timeline, and that's something that I feel like hasn't been brought out very much, is that the divestment across the board, the divestment demands are not talking about something that happens immediately or something that ends immediately, and it's something that is a phased process, and it's especially a process that we actually to some degree make as we go. Because we haven't seen the financial services sector. We have seen some firms that are doing some really amazing work. Thank you, Ken, for your work. But we haven't seen the kind of overall facilitation of this process that needs to happen, and that's going to increase when there's demand for it, when universities say we're interested in a product that is fossil fuel free or that is making the change that we need to have happen right now. And so the first step is, to some extent, is demand. And the universities that have already divested express this, that we're working for a solution. This is an active process. Yeah, I see you saying. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other final comments of other panelists? Or?
I would just quickly respond to the values question. I think that was a very good question that you raised with regard to the Earth Institute and so on, and it does seem to be the case, obviously, without any questions asked, that it would be, more synchronous with those values and so on to not have that investment. And at the same time, with regard to the recurring question of the shareholder activism, I mean, I think there are other ways you can still be activist, like you can be a shareholder activist, I suppose, if you own something, but on the other hand, you can engage in outsider activism, whether through an NGO or whatever, so you don't have to forego that role, that is still on the table, even if you don't own the stock.
We're getting ready to wrap up. I want to thank all of you for your participation.
Just in closing, I'd like to say on behalf of Barnard Columbia Divest for Climate Justice and the Advisory Committee on Socially Responsible Investing, we would really like to thank all of our panelists and our moderator for being here with us tonight. As you can tell, the issue of climate change is something that I personally feel very passionate about, and that I know the members of AXRI do, and that you all do as well if you're here tonight. So we thank you for your time, and we hope that we can continue these conversations beyond this panel and see how we as individuals, we as a university, we as a community can take action on this issue of climate change.
And I just wanted to thank also Barnard Columbia Divest for being such, I think, committed, tenacious, and helpful partners in putting this together, which is really a great partnership. And I really just want to thank the panelists. I think that the commitment that they made to come here tonight is really important to recognize. They're very busy, they have a lot to do, and I think helping us get more informed is a really helpful thing. Just two quick points before we all head out, which is, I think it's important to acknowledge when we go to climate change events that there is this phenomena called climate trauma. that we all live in the 21st century and we carry around with us the climate trauma of living in a world where we know there's climate change all around us. And on that spectrum is empathy and fatigue. And we have this huge need for empathy to deal with climate change, and then we get really tired because we can't empathize with the world. So I think one thing to think about when we walk out of here is, how do we have activism for others in our noble cause for justice, while at the same time activism in our own lives for taking care of ourselves? And that leads to empowerment, and the question of empowerment, and how do we empower ourselves and each other every day? And then also the question I'd like to task everyone with is, how do the facts that came out tonight link with information that we know about what else is happening around the world that makes us feel empowered and excited about what we can tackle together? And how does that help us make links between these really complex, wicked problems and our comprehension, so that we understand better how complex, but also what we can do together? So in terms of a plan, I think we all should think and put our heads together about what are the short-term activism things we can do linked to positive incentives, because I'm an economist, and positive incentives work better than negative ones in mobilizing human behavior. So let's think about what are the positive incentives that we can create in the short term to make people act and want to be part of the solution. And in the long term, let's think about the commitments that we need to make between ourselves and the communities that we want to impact around the world, whether that's Bangladesh or the Columbia community. So we need a strategy, we need a plan, as the Columbia alumni rightfully said. And I think the strategies are going to be multifarious and multiple in terms of their complexity and also their engagement, and all these stakeholders and all of you are going to be part of the solution every day. So let's keep the faith and also keep hope, and keep tenacious and keep discussing and dialoguing. So thanks very much. Have a good night.